So a while ago, I made a video entitled, "They Tried to Get Me to Post Chinese Propaganda." It is one of my most favorite videos I have ever made. It is about the conflict between the government of China and a bizarre cult known as the Falun Gong. They are engaged in a very vicious propaganda war against one another, and their target is you, even if you don't realize it. And in my opinion, this conflict is very morally ambiguous, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. Like most sensible people, I have an enormous amount of contempt for the Chinese government. It is clearly a cruel dictatorship that I believe to be a force for bad in the world. China's leaders have a ton to answer for in terms of their handling of the coronavirus pandemic, their oppression of Hong Kong, their support of rogue regimes around the world, and the systemic suppression of the rights of their own people. I think that probably the best thing that Donald Trump has done as president, and the thing that America's allies should be the most supportive of, are his efforts, however imperfect and bumbling, to contest the growth of China's economic and political power around the world. Now, all of that said, Falun Gong is quite obviously not a good guy either. Falun Gong is a cult, straight up. It is led by a megalomaniac fraud known as Master Li Hongzhi, who claims to be an interdimensional being with supernatural powers. We will get into the specifics of Master Li's lunatic worldview in a bit, but for the time being, suffice it to say that Falun Gong unambiguously has all of your major culty characteristics. Master Li pushes an elaborate system of behavior and thought controls on his followers, which are known as Falun Dafa.
Falun Dafa is an advanced cultivation system that was created by Mr. Li Hongzhi. It originates from the Falun Dafa cultivation practice in the Buddha school and cultivates Jun Shan Ren, or truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, the supreme characteristics of the universe.
The basic gist is that Master Li puts some magical force inside of your tummy, which is known as the Falun, and the Falun lets you harness all of the world's positive energy, which is known as Gong.
The Falun that Master has planted at the lower abdominal area automatically absorbs energy from the universe, transforms the energy, and helps a practitioner to practice. When rotating counterclockwise, the Falun emits energy. It can correct all abnormal states and bring salvation to sentient beings.
Properly harnessing this energy, in turn, requires doing a lot of repetitive, mind-numbing meditation exercises, as spelled out in the Master's various books and videos and multi-day seminars. But it's all worth it because Master Li says that those who prove their allegiance to Falun Dafa will eventually achieve superhuman levels of happiness, success, and health, just like him, the greatest man who has ever lived. Though it started in China, Master Li's outfit is currently based in this gigantic 400-acre compound in the scenic Catskills of New York. Here the Master lives with his most devoted followers, who tend to his every whim and venerate him as a divine being.
When Li Hongzhi would speak, the way she looked at him was just like he was God, because that's what these people believe, that Li Hongzhi is effectively God.
They venerate him so much, in fact, that according to a recent groundbreaking investigation by NBC, they even allow him to pick out their romantic partners. No gay stuff, though. The Master is very against homosexuality. Falun Gong has only been around for less than 30 years, but it has been very successful and now has followers all over the world. Its greatest success has always been among Chinese immigrants, but it has started to make considerable inroads with people from other backgrounds as well. There are now even multi-generational Falun Gong families with children who have been born into the cult. Now, you may be wondering why we don't hear more about this. Why doesn't Falun Gong get the same sort of negative press that other cults do, like the Scientologists or Nexium, or even comparatively milder things like CrossFit? Well, this is because Master Li has put together an incredibly sophisticated propaganda infrastructure, which is designed to obscure the reality of what he's up to. Like most cults, Falun Gong requires unpaid labor from its followers in order to test their faith, and Master Li uses this labor to staff his various propaganda outlets. Such outlets include the Shen Yun Ballet Show, which targets middle-class women, several right-wing news outlets, most notably the Epoch Times, which targets older men, and multiple YouTube and social media channels, which target millennials, like you. I will also note that they are not above just pitching themselves directly either. For example, they sometimes just run straight-up ads for themselves on YouTube with no pretense whatsoever. Alright, now let us talk about how Falun Gong propaganda works. This requires a bit of understanding of Master Li's general view of the world, which goes something like this. The Chinese government is the single most evil thing in the entire world because it oppresses Master Li's religion and forced him into exile in America. But the Chinese government is also evil because it is communist. And the very idea of a Chinese communist is deeply offensive to Master Li's ultra-xenophobic sensibilities. You see, Master Li believes that every race was created by a different god, and therefore all of the different races of the world should stay separate and never mingle or cross-contaminate with each other. He is quite infamously opposed to mixed-race people, who he considers to be spiritually defective. And in the next life, all of the different races will each live on their own planet, and we'll all be a lot happier. I believe this was an idea that Barney on The Simpsons once promoted as well.
I'm just saying that when we die, there's going to be a planet for the French, a planet for the Chinese, and we'll all be a lot happier.
Mr. Gumbel, you're upsetting me.
No, I'm not.
Anyway, the fact that the current government of China is communist is deeply repulsive to Master Li, not because of anything about communism in particular, but rather because it is a European ideology created by Europeans. The current rulers of China are thus literal demons from hell, dedicated to upsetting the correct order of the universe. China's true destiny is to purify itself of all foreign ideas, and indeed even most modern ones. This is a man who is fiercely anti-medicine and anti-science. His website even brags that at his compound in New York, there's barely a screw, nail, or metal joint to be found. Now, given the generally backwards-looking nature of his worldview, it may be unsurprising to learn that Master Li cribs a lot of his spirituality from ancient Chinese superstitions and folklore. And one traditional Chinese belief that he seems to be super into is this idea that our emotional and mental health is ultimately connected to the 5 essential organs of the human torso: the liver, the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, and the spleen. Meaning, as you become more emotionally and mentally strong, your torso organs get healthier too. And now, here comes the wild part. Since following Master Li's teachings brings Falun Gong practitioners to a state of near-divine emotional tranquility and spiritual well-being, it logically follows that they would have some of the best, most beautiful, most succulent torso organs in the world, and the demonic Chinese communists know this. So Falun Gong teaches that the communist devils have implemented a broad-scale program of murdering Falun Gong practitioners in order to harvest their world-class organs. The big muckety-mucks in the Chinese regime can then sell these organs at a premium on the black market, knowing how desirable they are. According to this one Falun Gong website, doctors in China will brag about having Falun Gong in stock, like they were Gucci handbags or something. What an outrage. Once you know these basic facts about how Master Li sees the world, it is very easy to tell if the criticism of the Chinese government that you're hearing is actually just Falun Gong propaganda. One very visible tick is making an obsessively big deal about the fact that China is run by a communist party. And by obsessive, I mean like mentioning it in every single reference to the government. Another tell is just portraying the oppression of the Falun Gong, which will always be described as a perfectly innocuous spiritual movement, as the single worst, most important human rights abuse that the Chinese government is committing. Now, Master Li's small community of followers in China have undeniably faced well-documented abuse at the hands of the Chinese regime. But when viewed in the context of, say, the oppression of the Chinese Muslims, it is very difficult to argue that this is even the most pressing religious liberty issue facing the country. But the biggest giveaway of all is just any mention of the organ harvesting conspiracy theory. Though the Chinese government has harvested the organs of executed prisoners in the past, this idea that they have some elaborate program of specifically harvesting the organs of Falun Gong practitioners is not a charge that has ever been credibly raised by anybody except for activists associated with Falun Gong in some way, which is because it is a charge that is ultimately grounded in what Falun Gong believes should be happening, rather than what actually is. Okay, so where Falun Gong propaganda seems to be enjoying a great deal of success these days is in right-wing America. This is because their anti-communist, anti-China messaging syncs up quite well with what a lot of conservatives already believe, which is that communism is wicked and that the Chinese government is a force for bad in the world, which are both perfectly fine things to believe. I believe those things. The problem is that the Falun Gong does not believe that China's communist government is bad because of an objective analysis of their policies. No, they believe it is bad because they think it is literally run by demonic spirits who are the primary embodiment of evil in this world. And since they believe this as a matter of religious principle, this means that their standards of evidence are not particularly high. This is very much the problem that has started to draw increasing negative attention to the leading news outlet of the Falun Gong movement, the Epoch Times. You've probably been seeing a lot of their ads lately because they have been spending an ungodly amount of money on YouTube advertising these days. Now, the Epoch Times has a sort of veneer of seriousness to it. You can browse through it and it won't seem all that weird at first glance. Relatively normal stories about politics and whatnot. But the extreme anti-China editorial position it takes, by virtue of the fact of who runs it, means that it is also very open-minded about all sorts of wild conspiracy theories. Most recently, this has taken the form of them speculating, without any evidence, this idea that COVID-19 was something that the Chinese communists cooked up in a lab in order to wreak havoc on the world.
The paper recently produced this documentary about the origin of the virus. It pushed so many debunked theories, Facebook flagged it as false information.
Here in Canada, there have also been reports of unsolicited deliveries of a particularly provocative issue of the newspaper to people who don't want it. But the problems with Falun Gong media go deeper than that. You see, some time ago, Master Lee apparently concluded that Donald Trump is a divine agent of heaven sent to us to destroy the Chinese communists.
So part of their spiritual belief,
yes.
And it is a sort of spiritual practice, right? Spiritual group, is that Donald Trump is like a key figure in delivering the final judgment and victory over Chinese communism that they so anxiously wait for.
That is 100% correct.
And what this particular prophecy means is that anyone who opposes President Trump and his divine mandate must surely be an agent of evil in some way. And this opens the door to basically any lunatic pro-Trump conspiracy theory you can imagine. Falun Gong's leading conspiracy theory arm is the YouTube channel Edge of Wonder, which I've actually talked about before. They're really big into the whole QAnon, Pizzagate, deep state stuff, as well as basically all the other greatest hits of the right-wing crackpot set.
According to Q, the source of the financial control of the world are three groups: the Rothschilds, George Soros, and Saudi Arabia.
And whenever China comes up, they hew tightly to the official Falun Gong party line.
Falun Gong is a meditation practice based on the universal principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and it believes in God or the divine creator. We have videos about this on YouTube.
So why are they being persecuted? Well, we believe this is because now there is a high demand of new lungs from victims who have the virus in China.
There are some other Falun Gong front channels on YouTube as well, which are managed by a larger media network known as NTD, or New Tang Dynasty. The most well-known of these is China Uncensored, which pushes a pretty steady stream of anti-China commentary in sync with general Falun Gong rhetoric.
The Chinese Communist Party is lying about the data. They're killing people for their organs, and they're making lots of money.
But some of the other affiliated channels are pretty weird. Like, they have a women-centric beauty channel called Beauty Within, hosted by these two pretty ladies. And while a lot of the content they make is just sort of general woman stuff, You can see in this video, they made about meditation. They are quietly pushing links to Falun Dafa, which is described as Fell and Rose meditation practice. And do you want to see some cool detective work I did? At one point, one of the ladies is reminiscing about her personal history with meditation.
You have a baby picture of you meditating. It's the cutest thing.
With my dad. So it was something that...
Freeze frame! This poster behind the dad here is an official Falun Gong poster, which illustrates all the 5 Falun Dafa exercises demonstrated by Mr. Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Dafa. Now, here is the big problem that I have with all of this. As I said in the beginning of the video, it is perfectly valid to be concerned about the growing geopolitical power of China. Personally, I think that this issue has the potential to define global politics for a generation or more in the same way that the power of the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. But if those of us concerned with the rise of China allow a leadership role to be played in this conflict by a loopy cult with little respect for the truth, then we are ultimately just shooting ourselves in the foot. We cannot allow the anti-China position to be defined by liars and crackpots and religious fanatics, which is of course exactly what the Chinese government often dismisses its critics as being. In particular, I am quite worried that the Falun Gong cult is getting in way too deep with the conservative movement of this continent. These days, I have noticed that whenever criticism is made of any Falun Gong aligned media outlet, particularly the Epoch Times, conservatives will rush to defend it. We saw this when Facebook banned the Epoch Times for deceptive advertising practices in 2019, or when mainstream media outlets like NBC or the CBC in this country publish critical reporting on them. There is a tendency to assume that because Falun Gong aligned media is pro-Trump and anti-China, well, they must be the good guys here and their critics just jealous progressives. Just anecdotally, I've also heard stories here in Canada of conservative politicians starting to get into Falun Gong spiritual practice or otherwise falling under the direct influence of the cult in some way, which is pretty disturbing. Now, the idea of American conservatives coming under the sway of a weird Asian cult might strike you as extremely bizarre, but there's actually a pretty strong precedent for this. Have you ever heard of the Moonies, the mass marriage people? They were started by a guy from North Korea known as the Reverend Moon. Like Master Lee, he also faced persecution in his native land and immigrated to America. And like Falun Gong, his wacky religion was also taken seriously by a lot of conservative Americans because of how stridently anti-communist it was. The Reverend Moon did a very good job marketing himself as a vital ally in the fight against North Korean communism. And as the years went on, he embraced more generally right-wing causes as well. He was a huge supporter of Presidents Nixon and Reagan, and was a particularly outspoken proponent of gun rights. Conservative leaders in other countries loved him too, including Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney. He even founded his own conservative newspaper, known as the Washington Times. Not the Washington Post, where I work, the Washington Times. But in retrospect, backing the Reverend Moon was one of many disastrous alliances the West made in the name of fighting communism. Today we know that the Moonies were a terribly oppressive and traumatizing cult that engaged in brainwashing, forced labor, and the physical and sexual abuse of its members. The Reverend Moon was also eventually outed as a crook who had enriched himself through all sorts of shady financial doings. And as he got older, his views eventually grew so extreme and insane that no one wanted anything to do with him anymore. He died in 2012 as a thoroughly disgraced embarrassment. There is a lot we do not currently know about the inner workings of Falun Gong and Master Lee's empire, but knowing what we know about cults, it is very hard to believe that this story will not ultimately end the same way as the Moonies. One of the most important lessons of the Cold War is that the enemy of my enemy cannot always be my friend. If we want to triumph in a battle of ideas, it is vitally important that those who profess to be on the side of what is morally right and just are able to maintain that integrity. And as long as Falun Gong remains an ally of the West, that task becomes a lot harder than it should be.